The wind swept across the Amargosa dunes, carrying with it the promise of another storm front from the Sierra. Evelyn Hargrove knew this place. She had patrolled these wastes in her 20s, a Bureau of Land Management ranger who could read a boot print in hardpan like a line of scripture. But the disappearance of the Turner family in 1981 had changed everything. They were presumed victims of a tragic accident, swallowed by sand and silence. When Evelyn returned now decades later, she carried a new clue, a quiet burden, and a vow the desert would not keep its counsel forever. She set her boots, carefully testing each patch of crusted soil before committing her weight. At 61, her knees no longer forgave missteps, but experience was her armour. The land had aged with her wind-polished ridges and saltbrush still standing against a horizon that never softened. She had once believed she understood this expanse, its moods and its traps. The Turner case reminded her otherwise. A whole family, 2 parents, 2 children simply gone. Only tyre tracks had been found veering off-road like a hesitation that became a death sentence. The search back then had been exhaustive aircraft sweeping with infrared volunteers, combing ravines, deputies driving dune buggies until their engines overheated. Nothing. The desert absorbed the effort without reply. Then 4 months later, a mechanic repairing a bulldozer stumbled on the family's station wagon. Buried to the wheel, Wells windows shattered, upholstery shredded. Children's toys strewn like bones. No bodies, no answers. For Evelyn then, a rookie ranger on perimeter duty, the discovery burned a lesson into her mind. Nature might conceal the truth, but people were the ones who put it there. She stopped at the old service track, crouched, and ran a hand through the sand. Her palm tingled with heat. The grains hissed against her skin like whispers. Tire impressions had long since been erased, but she could almost see them, a hesitation at the turn, a veer into emptiness. She remembered the coroner's phrase in the report, cause of disappearance undetermined. The neatness of the phrase had infuriated her. Nature did not shatter glass in precise angles. Nature did not scatter toys like warnings. Humans did. A dust devil flickered to life 100 yards away, twisting grit skyward, then collapsed with a sigh. Evelyn tightened her canteen strap and pressed onward, scanning for anything the old search had missed. She carried with her a photograph of the unearthed wagon, its roof caved by sand pressure, and the detail that had gnawed at her through the years, a matchbook logged but ignored. She had retrieved it from the county archive the week before. On its flap under poor light, she had found a faint graphite scrawl, a number barely legible. Someone had left a breadcrumb, and the desert had failed to hide it completely. Her breath steadied. The Turners were not lost to chance. They had been buried by storm, by human hands, or both. She meant to learn which. The desert had kept its counsel for long enough. The desert had a way of shrinking time. Evelyn felt it in her bones as she stood at the edge of the service track, gazing over the same ridges she had once crossed as a young ranger. 40 years had passed, yet the heat, the silence, the scent of dust were unchanged. What had changed was her own resolve. Back then, she was told to stay quiet, to defer to the sheriff's office. She had obeyed because rookies obey. But silence had teeth, and it had chewed at her for decades. She remembered the Turner children's faces from faded photographs, Colleen age 10 gap-toothed smile and Mark 7 clutching a plastic dinosaur. Evelyn had pinned those photos on her office wall for years after the case went cold. They stared back at her each morning, not accusing but waiting. The weight of their absence had become a private covenant. She promised herself that one day she would try again when she had the experience, the distance, and perhaps the courage. Now retired, and with no chain of command to silence her, she had returned to pay that debt. The desert tested her promise immediately. Heat shimmered across the flats, distorting the horizon into mirages, that seemed like roads, like rivers, like hope. She sipped sparingly from her canteen, each swallow carefully measured. A rattlesnake lay coiled beneath a creosote bush, its rattle blending with the insect hum. She gave it space. Survival here was always a negotiation, respect traded for passage. The Turners, Evelyn knew, had likely never stood a chance. A family car was no shield against this furnace, and yet she told herself it wasn't the sun that shattered those windows. It wasn't the wind that scattered toys like breadcrumbs. Someone had made decisions that turned wilderness into a tomb. That distinction mattered, and it steeled her. She had seen men try to blame the land for what they'd done, hunters who claimed coyotes had taken their victims, prospectors who buried secrets under talk of flash floods. The land could be merciless, yes, but it was never malicious. Only humans carried that gift. She pressed on toward an old BLM marker, the paint long flaked, but still legible beneath the scorch. She remembered planting it herself, hammering the stake with sweat running into her eyes. She leaned on it now, steadied, and whispered into the empty air, "I haven't forgotten you." The words dissolved into heat, but the act mattered, a promise renewed. Her plan was simple, though execution would not be. Start with the evidence that had been left behind. Re-examine every overlooked detail. Follow every trail, even if it ended in sand. She could no longer rescue the Turners, but she could refuse to let them remain erased. Somewhere beneath these dunes, beneath layers of lies, the truth remained. Evelyn meant to uncover it bone by bone, if necessary. The county archive smelled of mildew and paper gone brittle with age. Rows of metal shelving rose like mausoleum walls, each box a coffin for cases gone cold. Evelyn walked slowly down the aisle, her boots echoing against the concrete. She had signed her name into the visitor's log with the same care she once used on incident reports, clear, steady, no room for error. This was no sentimental errand, it was reconnaissance. The Turner file had been misfiled for decades, tucked into a shelf labelled Vehicle Forfeiture 1983. Bureaucratic accident or deliberate burial, Evelyn couldn't say. She lifted the box, its weight heavier than she expected, and carried it to the fluorescent-lit table. Dust flared as she pulled the lid free, catching in her throat. The first thing she saw were photographs the family wagon unearthed, glass spiderwebbed chrome dulled by sand. The images had haunted her memory, but here they were again, stark and unforgiving. She forced herself to study them clinically, noting the angles of shattered windows, the patterns of torn upholstery. Predators always left signatures. Human predators most of all. Beneath the photographs lay a collection of objects sealed in aging evidence bags. A child's shoe with sand caked deep into the seams, a cracked thermos, a rosary. And then, small, nearly overlooked a matchbook, its once white cardboard, now sepia with time. Evelyn recognized it instantly. She remembered standing in the evidence tent back in '81 overhearing a deputy dismiss it. Tourist litter, he'd said. She hadn't argued then. She was 22 green and outnumbered. But she had remembered. She lifted the matchbook carefully. On the front was the faded logo of a roadside diner, the kind scattered across Nevada highways like lonely outposts. On the inside flap, faint but undeniable, were markings in pencil. Numbers. She adjusted her glasses and angled the evidence bag under the fluorescent tube until the graphite caught the light. A phone number smudged half legible, but there. Someone had carried this with intent. Someone connected to the Turners had opened it, written quickly, and then left it behind in their grave of a car. Evelyn's throat tightened. This was the breadcrumb, not from the desert, but from human hands. She thought of Mrs. Turner's estranged brother Caleb, a man whispered about even in the sheriff's office. Gambling debts, unsavory company, a smile, that never reached his eyes. Caleb had lived just down the highway from the diner, whose logo now stared back at her. She felt the familiar pull of deduction, the gears turning. Motive. Opportunity. The quiet hand in the shadows. She slid the matchbook back into the box, sealing it as carefully as one might lay a body to rest. Ghosts filled the evidence room. Some silent, some whispering. The Turners whispered loudest. The diner's logo on the matchbook was almost illegible, a desert sun rising over a cracked highway. But the faint, graphite scrawl beneath it held more power than any symbol. Evelyn sat in her truck outside the archive window. Rolled halfway down, the Nevada wind nudging strands of grey hair across her face. She had copied the numbers onto her notebook. 702 555 163, last digit, blurred by smudge. Old handwriting, rushed perhaps, written with the point of a dull pencil. She knew the county clerk wouldn't waste resources chasing it. That was her burden. She stared at the numbers until they blurred. In her ranger days, she had learned to read tracks as a kind of language. Tire treads told of haste or hesitation of weight carried or weight lost. These numbers were the same signs etched in haste, meaning buried in sand. She tapped her pen against the page. 702, Clark County, Las Vegas Territory, and who had lived just on the city's edge in 81, Caleb Ricks, Mrs. Turner's brother, the one with the debts. Evelyn's internal voice sharpened cold and clinical. If the number tied to Caleb the matchbook was no coincidence, it meant contact. It meant planning. But she had been wrong before. Emotion could cloud the clearest deduction. She reminded herself confirmation must come from evidence, not resentment. She drove. The diner had changed hands half a dozen times over the years. The current owner was a woman in her 60s, with lacquered nails and the wary eyes of someone who'd served coffee to every drifter and hustler in the desert. Evelyn showed her the matchbook photo. The woman squinted, then shrugged. Before my time. But my daddy ran this place in the 80s. We had regulars, truckers, miners, gamblers. Folks scribbled numbers all the time. Evelyn pressed gently. Had Caleb Ricks ever been one of those regulars? The woman pursed her lips. Ricks? Yeah, rings a bell. Came around with a group from Laughlin. Always polite, but cash light. Later that night, Evelyn sat at the motel desk, the hum of the air conditioner rattling the window. She had traced the number through old directories, cross-checking with casino ledgers she accessed under the guise of genealogical research. The fragment matched a debt marker tied to Caleb Ricks, logged by a Laughlin casino in the spring of 1981. Her chest tightened, a mix of triumph and dread. It was a breadcrumb, yes, but one that cut deep. She leaned back, eyes closing against the fatigue. The Turners had not simply veered into oblivion. They had been led, lured, and the desert complicit, as always, had swallowed the evidence whole. Now, though the sand had begun to shift, the widow's house smelled faintly of machine oil and fried onions, as if her late husband's trade still clung to the walls. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table, its formica surface worn smooth by decades of elbows and coffee cups. Across from her, Mrs. Denton slid a small bundle forward, a grease-stained notebook wrapped in a rag. My husband kept this, she said, voice brittle, but steady. Sheriff never wanted it, said it wasn't evidence, just a man's scribbles. But he swore it meant something. Evelyn untied the rag and opened the notebook. The pages were smudged with fingerprints, the ink fading, but one sketch arrested her attention. A crude outline of a station wagon drawn from below. Arrows pointed to deep grooves along the undercarriage, annotated in hurried script drag marks, consistent with tow. Evelyn traced the lines with her finger. She knew the geometry of damage. A car buried by storm alone wouldn't show uniform gouges beneath the frame. These marks meant machinery chains or cables pulling metal across sand. Her pulse quickened, but she kept her expression neutral. He saw this himself. The widow nodded. Said he crawled under the car before the deputies hauled it off. Said you don't get gouges like that from wind. Told the sheriff. They waved him off. She stared into her coffee cup. He never forgave himself for letting it go. Outside wind rattled a loose shutter. Evelyn listened to its cadence. Nature spoke in whispers in clues. Men dismissed those whispers when they didn't fit the story they preferred. She flipped more pages. Lists of parts half-done math, then another sketch, a rectangle, with tread patterns looping around it. The annotation read, "Bulldozer? Old cat, maybe." Evelyn felt her chest tighten. In 81, a private contractor had been working dunes reclamation near the borax mine. She remembered the equipment parked out there, heavy machines with tracks wide enough to swallow a car. The pieces aligned with a quiet inevitability. Someone had dragged the Turner wagon with a dozer, buried it deliberately, and trusted the desert to finish the job. It explained the strange way sand had filled the cabin, as if poured, not blown. She looked up at the widow. "This is important," Evelyn said, her voice grave. "Your husband saw what the rest of them didn't." The woman's eyes glistened. "Then don't let them bury it again." Evelyn slid the notebook back into the rag, her resolve sharpening like a blade. The desert could erase footprints, but not intent. Somewhere beneath the years and lies, the Turner's killers had left their own trail carved in steel. Evelyn meant to follow it. Harold Pike still dressed like a man who believed appearance could outrun truth-pressed, shirt bolo tie boots, polished to a dull gleam. His office smelled faintly of cologne layered over old smoke, the kind of scent that clung to men who spent their lives negotiating across desks. Evelyn had asked for 15 minutes. Pike granted her 10. She began with the matchbook. It was found in the Turner vehicle, she said, placing a photograph of it on his desk. "You ever see one like this back in 81? Pike's eyes flicked down, then away too quick. "Thousands of diners out here. You can't pin a doodle in pencil to me." His voice carried practiced irritation, the cadence of a man rehearsing outrage. Evelyn did not push. Instead, she unfolded a copy of the mechanic's sketch, sliding it forward so the grease stains nearly brushed his cuff. "You knew the reclamation crews running bulldozers near the borax pits. Records show your construction firm had the subcontract." His jaw flexed, but his tone stayed measured. "Coincidence? We did jobs all over the state. Turner was the one running cons. He owed people, not me." The words landed neat, but Evelyn's instincts stirred. She watched his hands. Not a tremor, not a twitch, except when she mentioned the dozer. He had flattened his palm against the desk as if to steady it. A small tell, but tells mattered. She had spent decades reading landscapes. Human landscapes were no different. "Turner accused you of fraud, didn't he?" she asked softly. "Said you siphoned off investor funds. He threatened exposure." Pike leaned back, forcing a thin smile. "Dead men make convenient witnesses. But I was in Reno that weekend gaming convention. Hundreds of people saw me. Alibis Evelyn knew were like scaffolding. Solid at a glance, hollow inside if built too fast. She studied him in silence until the quiet stretched taut. Finally, he shifted in his seat, defensive. "Look, lady, that desert eats people alive. You want to blame someone, blame the sand, not me." The words echoed something she had told herself years earlier, a rookie's excuse for helplessness. But now she heard the deflection clearly. The desert might bury, but it did not conspire. Humans did. Evelyn gathered the papers without another word. As she stepped into the corridor, she let the silence settle. Pike had spoken too smoothly, too cleanly. The lies were rehearsed, the indignation calibrated. A man with clean hands did not need to scrub them so hard. Outside, the afternoon sun seared the pavement. Evelyn narrowed her eyes against the glare, her conviction hardening. Harold Pike wasn't innocent. He was careful, and careful men always left cracks for the truth to seep through. Red sat slouched against the frame of an abandoned shack, his skin the colour of burnt leather, his beard wiry and sun-bleached. Evelyn had tracked him through county records and half a dozen vague mentions in police logs. A drifter, then a drifter now. The kind of man the desert tolerated because he understood its rules take little stay moving leave no roots. When she introduced herself, he grinned without warmth. Haven't heard that case name in years. Turner family. Everyone's ghosts out here. Evelyn stayed standing, her silhouette framed against the setting sun. I think you followed them from the gas station on Highway 95. Why, Red scratched at his arm, eyes flicking. Because a man paid me. Said keep an eye on a wagon with 2 kids in the back. Easy money. Just watching. I thought it was a skip trace, maybe debt collecting. I didn't ask. He shifted his voice, lowering. But then I saw the other fella, the one in the pickup with the dozer tracks in the bed. That's when I walked. Didn't like where it was headed. Evelyn studied him, weighing truth against theatre. Drifters survived by telling just enough to earn a meal, never enough to be pinned. Why come forward now? She asked. He chuckled dryly. Because you asked the right way. And because it's been chewing at me. I've lived with worse, but kids that don't sit. He pulled a folded scrap of paper from his boot, its edges brittle with sweat. On it was a rough sketch of dunes marked with an X near a jagged cluster of stones. Windbreak out by the old borax pit. That's where I last saw 'em turn off. Wagon followed the pickup. Dust storm coming down. I kept walking. The wind moaned through the shack, rattling rusted tin. Evelyn felt a chill that had nothing to do with weather. She took the map, her fingers brushing grit from its surface. The X was clear, the line of the service road faint but traceable. Names she pressed. Who paid you? Red hesitated, then spat into the dirt. Middleman. Said he worked for Pike. Wore a tie in the desert, dead giveaway. Gave me $20 a pack of smokes, told me to walk away when the time came. I did. His eyes met hers, flat but honest. Wish I hadn't. Evelyn pocketed the scrap. Red had given her what she needed. Direction, confirmation, another link in the chain. She left him in the shack's shadow, his figure swallowed by dusk. The desert had sheltered his silence for 40 years, but now it offered her a map and perhaps a reckoning. Caleb Ricks greeted Evelyn with a smile, as polished as the silver buckle at his waist. His home in Laughlin was neat curtains drawn against the desert glare, the air conditioner humming steadily. A framed photograph of his late sister Mrs. Turner hung in the hallway. He gestured toward it, with a solemn dip of his head, as if rehearsed. I loved her, he said softly. I loved them all. My debts were my own, never theirs. His voice carried a gentleness that might have passed for grief, if Evelyn hadn't already traced the graphite trail to his name. They sat in his living room. Caleb slid a stack of receipts across the table, casino chits, fuel stubs, motel bills, each dated around the time of the disappearance. On the surface, it was tidy, too tidy. The kind of alibi built like scaffolding, enough structure to hold weight, but hollow if tapped. Evelyn leafed through them. The ink was faded, but the stamps were clear. Still, something gnawed at her. You were in Laughlin on July 18th, 1981, she asked. Caleb folded his hands, his smile faint. Yes, ma'am. I even won a little money that night. God knows I needed it. Evelyn tilted her head. July 18th. She remembered weather reports a sandstorm had swept across the Amargosa that same evening, grounding flights and stalling highways. A perfect cover, a perfect smokescreen. She glanced again at the receipts. The dates straddled the storm, days before, days after, but nothing fixed him to the critical hours when the Turners vanished. His eyes flicked to the matchbook photo she had placed on the table. For the briefest moment, his jaw tensed, then smoothed. That could be anyone's scribble, he murmured. Highway diners feed half the state. Evelyn studied him clinically, stripping away the surface charm. His grief was too controlled, his remorse too articulate. True sorrow stumbled, his flowed like a script. He was performing innocence with the precision of a man who had done so for decades. A gust rattled the window sand scratching against the glass. Evelyn thought of the mechanic's sketch the drifters mapped the dozer tracks that led to nothing but silence. Caleb's smile, polite and soft, was just another kind of desert mask, a surface that concealed a hollow beneath. She stood folding the receipts back into his hands. Thank you for your time. He inclined his head polite to the end, but as she walked out into the heat, Evelyn felt the weight of his alibi pressing false against her chest. Caleb Ricks had built himself a house of paper. It was time to find the match that could set it alight. The desert darkened as the wall of dust rose, a haboob rolling in from the basin with the force of a living thing. Evelyn crouched beside her truck map, from the drifter clutched in her hand, eyes fixed on the jagged stones that marked the windbreak. The storm's edge thundered across the horizon, blotting out sun and distance alike. She moved quickly. The air thickened with grit, each breath carrying the taste of chalk. Sand scoured her face, hissed against her goggles, rattled the truck's metal skin. To anyone else, it would have felt like chaos. To Evelyn, it was language. She had learned long ago that storms uncovered as much as they buried. At the base of the windbreak, she found it soil darker, packed unevenly, carved by floodwater. And there, faint but unmistakable impressions, like scars on the land. Tread, patterns broad and parallel, half erased by time, but revealed by the storm's stripping hand. Bulldozer tracks. Her heart hammered not with fear, but recognition. She traced the looping arcs with her boots, seeing how they circled, how they converged. The ground had been disturbed on purpose, a shallow depression filled and smoothed by machinery. Nature had softened it, yes, but the geometry betrayed intent. This was no accident of sand and wind, it was a graveyard forged by men. Lightning flickered within the storm, brief and stark, illuminating the abandoned borax pit beyond. Evelyn's mind assembled the pieces, the drifter's tale of a pickup, Pike's bulldozer contracts, Caleb's alibi stitched too carefully around a sandstorm no one could truly witness. They had used the desert's fury as camouflage, trusting it to devour the evidence. She dropped to her knees, pressing her palm into the depression. The sand gave slightly looser, less compact than the ground around it. She felt the weight of decades pressing back against her. Here, she thought, here is where they were left. The storm howled louder, forcing her to retreat to the lee of the stones. Vision narrowed to mere yards. But the discovery glowed in her mind like a flare bulldozer, treads encircling a grave storm-stripped earth, betraying the men who had shaped it. Evelyn's breathing steadied. The desert had kept its counsel for 40 years, but it could not silence the truth forever. Tonight, the storm itself had chosen to speak. The storm swallowed the horizon whole, a red-brown wall grinding across the flats. Evelyn was halfway back to her truck when she heard the sound, metal scraping over stone, a footstep forced against gravel. She turned too late. A figure lunged from the storm's blur, shoving her hard into the wash. The ground gave beneath her. Sand collapsed around her chest, filling her mouth with grit. For one instant, panic surged, a raw animal terror she hadn't felt since nearly drowning in a flash flood years ago. She forced her arms wide, kept her airway clear the way training demanded. Calm buys breath, breath buys time. A shape loomed above Harold Pike, his bolo tie whipping in the storm, his face set in grim determination. He shouted something, but the wind stole the words. His hands pressed down, forcing more sand into the hollow where she lay. A burial in real time. Evelyn twisted, digging her left hand into her boot. Her fingers closed on the hilt of the ranger's knife she never travelled without. She angled her body, feigning surrender, then slashed upward. The blade caught his sleeve enough to make him recoil. She used the moment to roll, gasping, pulling herself onto firmer ground as sand cascaded from her shoulders. Pike cursed, lunging again. The storm roared louder, a suffocating shroud. Evelyn fought not just him, but the desert itself, wind stripping her balance, grit scouring her eyes. Her lungs burned. She thought clinically, stripping fear away. Pike had strength, but he was older, too slower than fury could hide. His stance betrayed mining boots' heavy paw for shifting sand. She circled, forcing him upslope where footing betrayed him. "You buried them," she shouted, voice raw. "Dragged their car with a dozer. You thought the storm would cover it?" His eyes flashed with something between rage and desperation. "Caleb owed money. I just did the work." His admission tore free like an old wound breaking open. The storm lashed them both, filling every pause with suffocating silence. Pike lunged once more, but Evelyn pivoted, letting his weight carry him forward. He stumbled into the washarms, flailing. She pressed the knife to his throat before he could rise. Her breath ragged, her body trembling from exertion and grit. For a long moment, neither moved. The desert howled, impartial witness. Then Pike sagged, defeated. Evelyn bound his wrists with her belt, forcing him to his knees. She spat, sand chest heaving. The desert had tried to bury her, just as it had buried the Turners. But she had clawed air-found breath and drawn truth from the storm's maw. The storm relented by dawn, leaving the desert stripped and raw, as though the earth itself had been skinned. Evelyn sat on a stone outcrop. Pike bound at her feet, his face streaked with dust and shame. The silence was heavy, broken only by the hiss of sand still shifting down the wash. But she was not alone for long. A pickup truck growled over the ridge, its headlights muted by grit. Caleb Ricks climbed out slowly, smoothing his shirt, as if appearances still mattered here. His eyes widened when he saw Pike, kneeling, wrists bound. For a heartbeat, the mask slipped. Then it was back, the soft voice, the mournful tilt of his head. "Evelyn," he said, almost tenderly, "you don't know what you're doing. Pike's a bitter man. He'll say anything." Pike barked a laugh, bitter and broken. "Tell her, Caleb. Tell her how you sold out your own sister." Evelyn rose, the knife steady in her hand, though her muscles ached from the night's struggle. "The matchbook, the casino debt, the drifter's map. They all lead here. You lured them off-road. Pike did the burying, but the plan was yours." Caleb spread his hands saintly in gesture, though his eyes flicked toward escape. "I had debts. Desperate men were pressing me, but I never wanted them dead. Just scared, just leverage." His voice cracked carefully, measured to sound like remorse. Evelyn's mind cut through it clinically. Grief stumbles, guilt rehearses. Caleb's words were too neat, too balanced, and Pike's anger, though self-serving, rang with the resonance of truth. She pressed. "So, you offered them the family wagon, your own blood as payment. You led them to the dunes, knowing the storm would do the rest." Caleb's silence was the final confirmation. His jaw worked, his breath shallow. He glanced at Pike, then at Evelyn, calculating. For decades he had hidden behind paper alibis and polite smiles, but the desert had stripped him bare. "You were supposed to protect her," Evelyn said, her voice low. Instead, you sold her." For the first time, Caleb's composure cracked. His hands trembled, his eyes narrowing into something harder than grief, resentment. "She was always better than me," he hissed. "Perfect sister, perfect family. No one remembers the man who drowns in debt. They only remember who pulls them under with him." The admission hung in the morning air, heavier than the storm. Evelyn let the silence press on him, the desert itself judging. There was no triumph in her chest, only a quiet ache. She bound Caleb's wrists beside Pike's. The two men sat slumped, the storm's remnants swirling around them. The desert had finally given up its secret, not through mercy, but through inevitability. By the time deputies arrived, the sun had burned the storm's remnants into a pale haze. Evelyn stood apart as lawmen loaded Pike and Caleb into separate cruisers, their faces grey, their clothes stiff with sand. The men did not speak. Silence clung to them as tightly as the grit. She guided the officers to the depression near the windbreak, the shallow grave carved by steel and deceit. They marked it, staked. It began the process of excavation. Evelyn did not watch closely. She had seen enough in her years of service to know what they would find. Fragments, bones, remnants of toys. What the desert had kept hidden for 4 decades was finally surrendering to human persistence. The sheriff, a man younger than the case itself, offered her a nod of respect. "This'll go to court. You've done what others couldn't." But Evelyn shook her head. The desert did. It just took someone willing to listen. That night, back in her small motel room, she sat by the window, the curtains open to the ridges beyond. The moonlight painted the dunes silver calm, now almost forgiving. She thought of the Turners, the parents, the children, and of the promise she had made in silence years before. It had not been broken. Justice for the Turner family would come through the courts. Caleb Ricks and Harold Pike would face trial for their crimes. But the true justice Evelyn believed would come in ensuring that the Turners were no longer dismissed as a tragic accident erased by wind and time. They had names, they had a story, and now they had witnesses. As the first rays of dawn touched the horizon, Evelyn made a silent promise. She would testify. She would sit through the trials. She would stand in the desert again, not as a ranger, but as a keeper of memory. She had spent a lifetime preparing for difficult journeys, and this, perhaps the most important one of all, would be faced with the same resilience and determination that had guided her for decades. The desert had finally answered, and Evelyn would not let its voice fade again.
Thank you for listening to Brody's Stories. Until we meet again.